This was the question. When could we introduce leg extensions safely? Did you get that? It wasn't should we or shouldn't we. When can we do it safely? That's what everybody was experimenting with. That was what the research was worried about. Of course, the difference is that back then, we had 6 months to a year to rehab these people. You know, now if they've got 12 sessions, they got to get it all done and pretend the person's rehabbed in 12 sessions. And you know the body doesn't heal any faster then than it did in the 80s. I don't think. So, yeah, nowadays when I take a look at these people, I'm finished with rehab, they just suck. The integrity is not there. Of course, they don't use the bone, patellar tendon, bone graft much anymore. They're mostly using hamstrings and other things. So there's a very different rehab process when you're not dealing with a healing patella tendon, patellar ligament. It's very different. And think when we talked about ligaments, all the sensory things that are going on in a ligament or a tendon, those are disrupted through the surgery. Think about, it was a mess. So it is very, very likely that they could heal faster now. But is the person, if they still have any swelling, do they have the sensations they need to generate the proper orchestration? It still is probably too rapid. But the big thing was back then, how many weeks/months before this thing has the integrity it needs to tolerate this exercise? And why this exercise? Because it was perceived that there was more shear in this than other things. But realize everybody was also non-weight bearing for a long period of time. We had them non-weight bearing for months. This thing was so new they didn't know what to expect. So what are the real mechanisms of injury? How did people get to where they needed this surgery anyway? Was it leg extensions? It was a rampant leg extension injury year or decade? Absolutely not. In fact, every single ACL reconstruction we had back then, we reintroduced leg extensions with, of course, extreme control, not like the little throwing it guy. Every one of them. In fact, there was research, I've got that in, that said you don't actually get quads back completely until you do that version of exercise, because there is nothing loaded through a straight limb longitudinally that challenges the quads at the last 5-10 degrees of extension or shortening. You need this tangential loading. But all that's been lost. It's primarily been lost because of the fitness industry. This coinciding with the misunderstanding of functional. And the misunderstanding of functional is, as we've talked about, it's a motor learning misunderstanding. Functional doesn't have any rationale anyway, it's just a cult. But this mechanism of injury that led up to this concern was always a functional position. It was so funny when people would talk back when functional became a big deal. Yeah, and this is safer for the knee. These functional, the foot on the ground is a functional thing. This is your primary mechanism of injury, boys and girls. Now, I'm not saying your foot's on the ground is what's causing it, but it's the forces and the relationships and the decelerative factors. Now, I pulled a few things off the internet here, and what's funny is, or not so funny, it's kind of typical, there's some conflict amongst them. Certainly valgus is a piece of the puzzle. What's going on in the foot precipitates and adds to valgus, but the thing they show here is internal tibial torsion. Now, I'm assuming they just don't mean on the foot or in space. I'm assuming they mean at the knee. But as we've talked about, knee rotation and tibial torsion aren't necessarily the same thing, because if your tibia rotates and your hip internally rotates, then they're both internally rotated, so there is no knee rotation. This is not clear, but we'll go with it. And you're flexing at the same time. That's more of a side view right there. Now you compare that to this other one over here, and it's got a similar position, and they say there's a point of no return. When it gets so far they can't pull themselves back out of it, but you're still going into valgus, you're still flexing, but they show external knee rotation, tibia on femur. So who's right or who's wrong? Or is it simply, like some of these things have said, it's just associated with rotation, and if you go far enough either way, it's not going to be good. That seems to be the consensus now. I brought this one up just because I thought it was funny. They're showing internal rotation of the tibia on the femur. I think the bigger problem is the shoe. I think anytime somebody wears that specific shoe, there's going to be knee problems. That's just my opinion. This is it, man. There's a real live picture from a grainy movie film, and you can see that knee going in. You can see this tremendous amount of inversion, flattened foot, pronation, blah, 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 blah. And there you go. That's it. The number one mechanism of injury for non-contact ACL tears. Leg extension is not on the list. Not too worried about that. Now, if you're throwing it like that one guy did, you know, all bets are off, because that's just asking for physics trouble. But which one of these should be most afraid of? Now, you can do dumb things here. You can turn your knees in and turn your knees out and think you're working different things when really you're just messing with the joints and the forces, but that's still not a shear problem, right? Millions and millions and millions of people play this without worrying about their knees. This is a concern. Do you understand how ridiculous it is to even say that? Millions of ACL injuries. Not only zero that I'm aware of, and I haven't seen everything, zero that any orthopedic surgeon I know and sports medicine specialist has ever seen. Now, is it possible from this? Yes. Do I know anybody that's ever seen it? No. Yet. I don't get it. It still boils down to everything you're going to read about open versus closed chain is still about ACL reconstruction rehab. Every piece of research about it is a bunch of physical therapists and orthopedists being concerned about already torn, repaired, reconstructed ACLs. And it can still be introduced with great outcome. I don't know. Here's a fun thing though. This is fun. Hopefully this is loud enough you'll be able to hear it without distortion. Don't get caught up in the story. There's some numbers here that are valuable. Valuable perspective, okay? Let's see what we can do. Do I need to get this so you can, let's try this again. Oh, you guys ready?
How powerful was Edson's kick? Data from the accelerometer reveals that the 16-ounce ball left Edson's foot traveling at 72 miles per hour. Wind resistance slows it by nearly 20 miles an hour before impact. But it still smacks John upside the head, literally knocking him backwards with 158 pounds of force.
It's so annoying to show that in class because in the end people are like laughing at the guy falling. I'm like, it's not really the point. Here is the point though. See if I can write on this thing without it messing up. What do you say? 77 miles per hour, 16-ounce ball. This was the start. This was the beginning. What happened in the end? It hit the guy at, I think he said, 55, I don't know, something like that, and 158 pounds of force. So where am I going with this? Okay, if that ball hit that guy with 158 pounds of force, while traveling at 55 miles an hour, it left this guy's foot at 72 miles an hour. A ball sitting still was accelerated almost instantly in a really short space. It was accelerated from 0 to 72 miles an hour. You have to understand that foot had more than 160 pounds coming into it, if it slowed down that much and still had that much force. Now we could get somebody in here with a calculator and they could probably figure that out, but there's still some information that's missing a little bit. My point is this. Nobody is worried about that. That is over 160 pounds coming in that person's foot. Which, by the way, is further down than his ankle, where you might put a pad, so that's already increasing the shearing forces, right? Now you're saying, oh, but Tom, he didn't kick it like with knee extension. You're missing the point. I understand his whole body was moving forward. I understand his hip was going into flexion with major inertial forces as well as trunk muscles, but it doesn't matter, because the bottom line is that near full extension, let's call it 20, 30 degrees of bend, 20 degrees of bend. By the way, it's in the last 20, 30, 20, 10, 0 degrees is where they're worried about this shearing thing, when they're worried about it. And that's exactly what's happening. And that force, regardless of whether it's coming in right there, and it's force on the knee, no matter what was moving. If the whole thing's static and nothing's moving, and you put 160 plus pounds in one leg. Now, I have a question for you. Do you know anybody that does unilateral 160 pound leg extensions? I've known a lot of people that did 300 pound leg extensions bilaterally. And quite frankly, most of them, if they hadn't been kicking it and cheating like crazy, couldn't have done that, no matter how big they are. But we're not concerned about this. We're concerned about a leg extension. And nobody ever says a light leg extension is okay. They just say a leg extension has too much shear. They're insinuating that whether it's 50 pounds bilaterally, 100 pounds bilaterally, or 1,000 pounds bilaterally, it's all the same crap. Wrong. Your average person walking in there, average person, real live person, using between 30 and 100 pounds bilaterally. That's 15 to 50 on one side and 15 to 50 on the other as a range. But we're not worried about this. Interesting. Now realize his quad has to be contracting because he continues to straighten his leg. And it's certainly not bending backwards when he hits the ball, which would indicate his quad's not enough to control that force. Guys, this is pretty simple logic. So did you ever think about this? Did you ever think, why do we rehab these guys anyway? It dawned on me. We do all this work with them. We're so concerned about leg extension, no leg extension, what's better for the ACL, even though there's probably not a concern. All so they can go out and do it again. The whole purpose is to return them to the sport that caused the thing in the first place. And we're even going to put metal and plastic upon them to try to hold stuff better because we're pretty sure their body can't do it by itself. What is it about this sport thing that makes us make these decisions? What is it about this thing where we created an entire industry around what is basically helping people get over a car wreck so they can return to the same accident? I really don't get it. That's one reason I had to stop. It's like, why do you, oh, now we got the other knee. Oh, now we got this, oh, the one that was repaired last year, now we're doing that one again. It's like, why do you devalue walking so much? Walking pain-free is one of the best things in the world when you've spent months not being able to do it. I don't know. Just some perspectives. Has nothing to do with the topic really, right? So let's get back to this. When it comes to joint forces, and really everything we talk about, please, let's work towards not generalizing. Everything we say about an exercise, about a person, about a recommendation, about a concept such as joint forces needs to have context, disclaimers, what ifs, scenarios that are most likely to make it true, an acknowledgement of scenarios that may make a statement false. And you're saying, you mean we can't just say shear is bad? No, not in an exercise professional, not in a mastery-oriented, not in a wise endeavor. No. I hear this all the time. You've heard it too. Maybe every day, depending on the community in which you practice. Leg extensions, fill in the blank, shear. Produce a lot of shear. Have a lot of shear. Oh my gosh, the way people say it, the bottom line is, there's an association that they can't correlate. They don't know if there's a cause. They have no earthly idea, except this is what people say in their world, and it's sad. Shear is bad. I have to question both of those severely because they're both very likely wrong unless you give me some very specific circumstances. As general statements, they're wrong. One of the biggest things I hope you learn from this is there is absolutely no movement at a joint without a force. A rotational component that is typically producing, not always, is typically producing a shear. In so many ways, shearing force is movement. And I'm not talking about translatory sliding. While that's true also, it is that rotational component. It is this. It is producing the rotation. If you look at the surfaces sliding past each other, that is shear producing one contact surface moving relative to another. How could shear be bad? The same way a hammer could be. The same way erosion could be from a tsunami. Too much of anything, right? How much? Which joint are you concerned about? Are you really concerned about a knee? Listen, if someone's not in a sport, I'm not all that concerned about a knee. Certainly it happens, people stepping off something, there's that collapsing thing we looked at, and next thing you know, there's an ACL. I knew a guy that did it. Stepped off of a 2-foot landing and boom, there he goes. Next thing he's having surgery and ACL rehab. But the shoulder in the gym is a far greater concern when you look at how exercises are typically executed for specific shoulder goals, i.e. pecs, whatever. This is where we get into trouble. This is the thing, it's the joint most susceptible, it's the exercises performed the most unreasonably. And to me, one of the biggest things is the vast majority of the people trying to scare people with this word, trying to sound smart with this word, can't define the word. Can't show me a scenario. Sure can't calculate it, not that that's everything. You don't have to calculate something to understand the thing to some degree. But that's our industry.